summary is for Proverbs Session number 5 in the Explore the Bible series on Proverbs chapter number 5, verses 3 through 18. You know, there's an old saying that says you can listen and learn, or you can live and learn. And there's a lot of truth to that. Listening and learning is probably the wiser way to go. Living and learning can be really, really painful. And one of the beautiful things about the book of Proverbs is that we can listen and learn, and we're getting to lean in and listen to what a father is saying to his son as inspired by the Holy Spirit in all these different areas of life. And in the Proverbs chapter 5, he deals with a particularly dangerous and volatile area in our lives that we all make decisions about, and that's the area of our sexual lives, dealing with sexual immorality, adultery, that kind of a thing. And so one of the amazing things is, as we lean into what he's saying here, we can avoid all kinds of pain and danger as we have a strategy to kind of defeat sexual temptation in our lives. It's really important that we do that. We have to have some kind of a plan, some kind of a strategy to be able to avoid disappointing God, hurting ourselves, hurting those around us by giving into sexual temptation. And so the big idea for this lesson is that we can employ 3 strategies to defeat sexual temptation in our lives. Now, we're going to start in verse number 3, where it says this: "For the lips of a strange woman drop as the honeycomb, and her mouth is smoother than oil, but her end is bitter as wormwood, sharp as a two-edged sword. Her feet go down to death. Her steps take hold on hell. Lest thou shouldest ponder the path of life, her ways are movable, that thou canst not know them." So this first point I want to make is that the first strategy that the father tells the son really here is to know the reality. Know the reality. I can almost imagine the father bringing the son over and putting his arm around his son and saying, "Hey, you see that woman over there? She looks beautiful. She seems alluring. She seems great, but she's a strange woman." The idea of strange there is not weird. The idea of strange there is the idea of her being a promiscuous woman. May very well be even a harlot, a prostitute. And he's admitting to his son, there is something that seems alluring there. There is something that seems tempting about that, tempting about her. And he uses 2 items. He says, the lips of a strange woman drop as a honeycomb. In the time in which this was written, the honey was the sweetest thing that they had. So he says, it looks like that it would be tasty. It looks like, it says, in her mouth is smoother than oil. This is most likely a reference to olive oil, something that was highly prized. It was connected with life and prosperity and health. Olive oil was used in a myriad of different things, and the Bible even refers to a lack of oil, or a lack of olive oil being like suffering, being like poverty. And so he's saying to his son, arms over his shoulder, looking at this woman from a distance and saying, "Hey, I know she looks like it's the best that life can give. She looks physically attractive. Sexual immorality is alluring." But then he uses this conjunction that's really important. He says, but her end is bitter as wormwood. So you have here honey and oil. That's what she seems like, this strange, promiscuous woman. But here's the contraction: her end is like wormwood. Wormwood is, the word for wormwood is translated in Amos as hemlock, which we know is definitely like a poison. And so the idea here is that there's a bitterness, there's a death element, there's a poison element to her end. He also says that that her mouth is sharp as a two-edged sword. The word that's translated there, two-edged sword, is almost best translated mouth of swords, or he's saying she looks like she has honey in her mouth, but really she's got razors in her mouth. She's got swords in her mouth. This is really what she is. And then he says about her feet go down to death, her steps take hold on hell. And then he says her ways are movable. And the idea there is that her ways are unstable. If you get involved with her, you're going to be in an unstable place along with her. That's how she is. And so basically he's saying the reality, son, is that sexual immorality looks tempting. It looks like life enhancing. It looks like it will be great. But if you get sex outside of God's intention for your life, it's going to be more like poison and swords than honey and oil. It's going to look more like death, hell, and instability than it looks like life, health, and peace in your life. He's saying, don't give in to what seems right. You need to give in to what you know is right by the Word of God. And so there's that temptation. He says you need to know the reality. So it's in that framework, and it's this first strategy that we need to understand that sexual temptation, sexual immorality looks good, but there is a price to pay for sexual immorality. There is an end to that is a high cost. There's a high cost to low living, right? And that leads us to our second strategy. And the second strategy is this: rely on removal. That's kind of a strange phraseology. It's not something that wouldn't be a typical way that we phrase things, but I'm using the Bible language here to kind of help you understand it. He says in verse 7, kind of a transition in thought, "Hear me now, therefore, ye children, and depart not from the words of my mouth." He's saying, listen, son, listen, kids, pay attention to what I'm about to tell you. Verse 8, "Remove thy way far from her." Remove thy way far from her. The idea here is, if you're not close to her, stay far away. If you are close to her, run. That's the idea. Remove your way far from her, and come not nigh to the door of her house. When it comes to sexual immorality and people that will entice you to sexual immorality, the idea is to run. What does it say in I think it's 1 Corinthians, maybe 2 Corinthians? Flee fornication. Every other temptation, every other sin happens outside the body, but sexual sin hurts the body, Paul says. Flee, run, remove, get away, run. Remember Joseph and Potiphar's wife? That's the great biblical illustration of this. Joseph was being tempted by Potiphar's wife, and he got out of there. She tried to grab his clothes, and he came out of his coat and ran, right? That was Joseph's strategy, and that should be our strategy. And so maybe Solomon, I'm not exactly sure if it is Solomon, but the father here is saying, run, remove thyself. And then in verses like 9, 10, 11, 12, all the way down to verses 13 and 14, he tells them why. He said you're going to have certain loss in your life. If you give in, if you don't run and you give in to sexual temptation, he says there will be 4 losses. The first is the loss of honor. He says, "Lest thou give thine honor unto others, and thy years unto the cruel." So the first thing is honor. The idea of honor there is the idea of majesty, the idea of glory. It's not so much about reputation, although you will lose your reputation. So many people have when they give in to sexual sin. But the bigger idea is this idea of giving the best of your health and the best of your life to a woman you don't even know. He's saying you're going to give your honor, give your glory, give your majesty, give what people see as like respectable about you to somebody else. And then he says there'll be a loss of time. It says you're going to give your years unto the cruel. There is a sense in which that when you're giving over your life, the best of what you have, and even your time, years of time, over to people who don't even love you, people who want to use you. And then he says, "Lest strangers be filled with thy wealth, and thy labor in the house of a stranger." You ever heard the term alimony, child support, lawyers' fees, doctors' fees? there is a high cost in money to those who at times potentially cost to those who do wrong, who commit adultery. And then in verse 11, the idea of joy. So you lose your honor, you lose your time, you lose actual finances, money, and then you even lose joy. He says, and thou mourn at the last when thy flesh and thy body are consumed. And then you end up living with regret. In verse 12, 13, and 14, he says, how have I hated you're going to say, how have I hated instruction? My heart despised reproof, and have not obeyed the voice of my teachers, nor inclined my ear to them that instructed me. I was almost in all evil in the midst of the congregation and assembly. The idea here is you're living with regret. You're living with the possibility of living outside of integrity beyond just the sexual immorality, and even being a hypocrite and being involved in religious practice and coming together and doing it while still having this problem in your heart, never taking care of it. So he says, if you don't run, there are consequences: loss of honor, loss of time, loss of money, loss of joy. There's regret that abounds when we do this. And so the remedy is to run. That's the idea, that we remove ourselves from it. And then number 3, pursue the remedy. Pursue the remedy. This is not the only remedy to sexual temptation, but it is a remedy. He says in verse 15 and going on to verse 18, drink waters of thine own cistern and running waters out of thy own well. So the idea here, he's using thirst and the quenching of thirst with drinking, like being satisfied sexually with your wife or your husband. The idea is that there's a danger in thinking that sex is this dirty, horrible thing, but yet God designed sex. He came up with it. It's his plan. And he wants people who are married to be intimate with each other, to help satisfy each other sexually, relationally, emotionally, physically. That's what God desires. And so what he's saying is, instead of going with some strange woman and abandoning your family, abandoning integrity, living with a high cost and of time and honor and all these other things we talked about, satisfy yourself by pursuing your spouse. He says, lest thy fountains be dispersed abroad and rivers of water in the streets. Let them be only thine own and not thy strangers with thee. Here he's talking about the result of procreation, which are your children. And he says, if you're going to have kids because you pursue your wife or your husband in that way, let them be your own kids. Don't have the danger of steps and halves and all the things, that the pain that goes along with that. He says, pursue your own kids. And he says, let them be only thy own and not strangers with thee. So don't have all this, the problems with that come along with those things. Verse 18, let thy fountain be blessed and rejoice with the wife of thy youth. You know what he's saying is, pursue your spouse. Pursue your spouse. Love your spouse. Love your kids. This is what you do, and you'll be satisfied in the way that God's called us to be satisfied. Now, what an incredible strategy. Know the reality. Sexual temptation looks alluring. It looks like honey and oil, but in the end, it's more poison than swords. There's a high cost. There's the cost in honor. There's the cost in time and money. There is the cost when it comes to your regret, right? These are all high cost. So he says, instead of doing that, remove yourself, run, get away, and instead pursue a loving relationship with your spouse. Now, I want you to be very aware that when you teach this lesson, there are going to be people in just about every class that are single, and people that are maybe widowed, divorced, and obviously they may be in a situation where, like, well, that can't be the only strategy because I'm not married, and maybe God doesn't want me to get married. We ought to find our satisfaction ultimately in the person of Jesus Christ, and so that's part of what we want to do. But God has made man for woman and woman for man. That's how God designed it. And there's so much more joy when we embrace God's design for sex, embrace God's design for family. God brings those things along as a blessing. And so, what practical advice that we're given here in Proverbs chapter 5. I hope this has been helpful for you as you thought through the lesson. I think that as you talk to married people and single people, you need to think through how this applies to them. And we always want to be above reproach. We don't want to be crass. We want to be, but we do want to be clear. And so let's do a good job of that this week. Hey, enjoy the rest of your week, and we'll be praying for you as you preach on Sunday.